were all of a sudden free, and the leaders of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula come from that group of people. A few people from Guantanamo as well. So you have that as a turning point. You have a couple of other turning points. Economic reform, which was just barely getting off the ground. You can't have development without economic reform. The U.S. cannot impose development from the outside. But with the Millennium Challenge, you had a mechanism for creating incentives for the Yemeni government to reform. And you had reformers inside Yemen, people like Abdul Karim al-Arhabi. So you were gathering speed to get launched. They qualified for the threshold status in the Millennium Challenge, and then they released Bedawi, one of the USS Cole conspirators. And Washington, in understandable frustration, pulled the rug out from that program, canceled it. So where you had the bud of reform, all of a sudden gets broken off. It goes nowhere. Now, I agree that you had to do something, to respond to the al-Badawi incident. But why pick the thing that is in your interest? And why pick the group of people in Yemen, the fragile reformers who are most vulnerable, and undermine them? I mean, go after the military. Go after something in the military sphere. The military is going to do fine. So we made a major mistake in that regard. Is that enough? No, there's another. Oh, the 2006 election, the presidential election. It kind of carries forward with 2003. There's an opposition candidate. He's a credible opposition candidate, Shemlan. The media is relatively open. Shemlan does a relatively decent job. He gets 22% of the vote. Not good here, but in Yemen, pretty respectable. But the problem is that Saleh has a different standard than any U.S. candidate would have. And for him, 22% of the vote is this total rejection and risk and everything. And so you see this tendency towards some political reform just kind of closing down, and Saleh starting to go in the other direction. So to the extent that in January of this year, he was presenting legislation to the parliament to make him president for life. So there are a lot of factors here, and I try to lay them out.
Art has a question.
Art Hughes, MEI. I'd like to take advantage of some of the comments at the very beginning and fast forward to the present circumstances. From the Yemeni point of view, Saudi Arabia, of course, has always been problematic, always trying to assert influence. They have been a source of a lot of cash flowing into Yemen, of course, and payments to buy influence and so forth. But they also supported secession in 1993. And what are their objectives now? Because it seems to me that the Southern movement does have some traction, does have some capability. The Houthis in the north. So a subset of this question is, will Yemen retain its unity under any conceivable scenario in the next 3 to 5 years, the next period?
The short answer is not necessarily. I do think the Saudi policy changed fundamentally in 2000, Art. I think Abdullah understood the mistake he'd made during your time, which was quite an embarrassment. And with the Treaty of Jeddah, and with that demarcation of the border, I think you have a fundamentally different situation than in your day. And I think the Saudi interest, they translated their interest from protecting themselves by enfeebling Saleh and his government to protecting themselves by supporting Saleh as the best tool to keep Yemen together and to keep the tribes and terrorism under control. Now, I don't want to push that too far, because I don't doubt that the Saudis hedge those bets and retain other connections. I don't think they went all in for Saleh, but I think they started to see him and a strong government in Yemen, as an asset rather than a liability, which they had perceived it in the past. And then we see how they collaborated on the al-Houthi question, which I think is additional evidence that they saw things in a common strategic picture. Will Yemen stay together? I don't think there's any guarantee of it. The centrifugal forces are very, very strong indeed. USIP and NDI had a very interesting teleconference, however, with the opposition, with the protesters in Sana'a. And they were representative. They had an Islah person, a former ruling party, and then some of the younger people. All of them were unanimous in a desire to keep Yemen together. And what they put forward was the argument that in keeping Yemen together, Saleh is now the problem, not the solution. And if you replace Saleh and you replace some of those policies vis-a-vis the al-Houthis, vis-a-vis the Southern movement, you stand a much better chance of keeping Yemen together. And I think that's an argument that deserves serious consideration. And I would say more than that, it deserves serious work to find mechanisms to take this vision, which the reformers have, which the opposition has, which the revolutionaries have, and help them find ways of realizing this vision.
Let's take two questions together, the gentleman back here and the gentleman back here. Is that all right if we take two questions since
Sure.
we're running out of time? Yep.
My name is Jason Sturm, a student at George Washington. I'm just starting to learn about Yemen, so excuse my ignorance, but I understood Anwar al-Awlaki to have no operational leadership role in AQAP. He's mostly a propagandist, and at that, he's mostly persuasive in the English-speaking community, not the Arabic-speaking community. So the past 48 hours, I've been very confused to hear so many people calling him potentially the next Osama bin Laden. Am I mistaken, or could you help me enlighten me why that might be? Thank you.
Okay. And then we'll get this gentleman here.
A very different question, but back to the first one, sir. Charles Kestenbaum, BK International. You've defined a losing hand in your initial statement, saying that no development without security, no security without development, yet on an institutional basis, where is AID functioning efficiently now in anywhere in the world with conflict zone with an efficient and effective development program? Where's their money? And prior to the awakening, spring awakening, I was trying to do economic development business, private business as a private businessman in Yemen, and unable to get anybody at the embassy or AID to even acknowledge they had a program before the spring awakening and the current events. So with a failed effort at development prior to this mess and no capacity to do it or funds to begin with, how do you see this actually happening then? And how can you have an ideology or a belief system that is doomed itself by its very nature to fail? Please.
Good. Let's take al-Awlaki first. My reaction would be similar to yours, that I know Osama bin Laden and al-Awlaki is no Osama